Welcome to the Carrie Barrett Show, the go-to podcast for leaders. Are you a founder, executive, or part of a dynamic team? Then you're in the right place. I'm Carrie Barrett, your on-camera confidence, public speaking, and delivery coach. Each week, we dive into practical tips, insightful interviews, and engaging stories to help you communicate with confidence and lead with impact. Whether you're in the boardroom or on the physical or digital stage, this podcast will help you elevate your presence. Let's get started. Good morning and welcome to the Carrie Barrett Show. In today's episode of the show, we're going to be talking about the balance between showing up perfectly and showing up with warts and all, forward facing, but take me as I am mentality. So before we get to that, who am I? And why should you listen to me? I'm Carrie Barrett. I'm the go-to consultant for executives and law firms who want to up-level their visibility with effective virtual communication and professional presentation skills. Okay, perfectionism versus authenticity. What exactly is the right balance between the two? So I was working with a client a couple of weeks ago, and we were getting ready for, during this particular session anyway, for a big virtual client pitch that this client was not only creating, but also practicing and prepping for. And in the midst of practicing, he was a little bit nervous and he stopped mid-script, if you will, and said, that he believed his biggest speaking problem is a rampant use of filler words. One of the things that I fall back on regularly is, does that make sense? And in his mind, he didn't see any way of getting rid of them. And he needed, again, in his mind, to get rid of them so that he sounded credible, right? So he said, I can't get rid of them. I sound like a friggin' idiot. He didn't say friggin', but you get the point. And I do understand where he's coming from. And you have heard, if you've been following my live streams or watched any of my video content or content on any of my social media posts or my blogs, using so and random other, words or phrases that are a crutch. And if you use them, for example, at the start of every single sentence, it is distracting and it makes whatever it is you're saying sound less important perhaps than it actually is. It's more missable, if you will, when you surround whatever it is that you're saying by, I hope that makes sense. And nobody wants what they're saying to sound less important than it is or to have it sound less urgent. Nobody wants that. You will see some people attack this problem. And when I say some people, mentors or coaches, and they attack it in a punishing way is probably the best way to describe it. So for example, what I mean by that is every time you say or do something that you find is, unpleasant. Take a shot of vinegar, I don't know, go do a cold plunge, something along those lines, something that will associate this particular sound, because oftentimes it's not really even a word, with something physically unpleasant. Or they may say every time a swear jar, every time you say you put a dollar or whatever it is into a jar, and could potentially work. It's fun to do maybe at parties, but it's not really a huge game changer. It's not going to create long-term change and understanding of effective communication. And oftentimes we find that we use those sorts of words when we are, I just did it now, it's contagious. We find that we use those words when we are in an ad lib environment and we're thinking of whatever it is, the next thing that we're going to be talking about. We're coming up with it real time in our minds before it spits out of our mouths. And so even when we're in those situations, regardless of whether we have punished ourselves with a shot of vinegar or a cold plunge or something along those lines, if we haven't created real change, we're still going to fall back into those habits or those crutches, if you will, when we're in an environment where we can't stop and take a shot of vinegar or do whatever it is that takes our mind off of it and punishes us for using those words. If using filler words is actually one of your biggest speaking challenges, there's a couple of things that I do recommend. Number one, and you've heard me talk about this quite a bit on live streams and in content, speak, riff, if you will, into your phone, your voice recorder, your notes for a couple of minutes, 30 seconds, at least once a day. More than once is even better. You can also, and you've heard me talk about this as well, get curious about why and when you are using those filler words and usually it's because you're in an ad lib situation. You don't know exactly what it is that you're going to say next. So you're creating an audible space is what it's called. And perhaps it's also because you don't feel incredibly comfortable with whatever it is that you are talking about. So then you can practice replacing whatever your go-to crutch sound is with a breath, or do something else that's physical. Sometimes I recommend breaking gaze with the camera or the audience, or tapping your leg so you have a physical sensation. Some need to swallow that word or that sound and take a breath and then start over again. And then I would say practice listening to yourself. The first tip I mentioned was riffing into your phone for a couple of seconds, 30 seconds at least once a day, and then go back and watch or listen. So here's what you don't want to do if in fact ums and ahs are your biggest challenge. Don't use your next high stakes gig as a training ground. Your next big client pitch, your next media opportunity, your next presentation. It's way too high stakes. And there are already a million other things that you're focusing on that are going to make much more of an impact if you're practicing than saying or too many times. So that's takeaway one from today's episode. But I want to dive into the bigger issue, which is really the conundrum, if you will, of that perfectionism mindset versus the take me as I am mentality. Warts and all, I am who I am. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the quest for perfection. Now, I want you to imagine a speaker who spends hours and hours refining their speech, their presentation, their talk, whatever it is, their client pitch, and they are obsessed with eliminating every single or whatever it is, and they are striving for their version of perfection. And you may have heard me talk about great speakers before. One of the ones that I refer to on the regular is Winston Churchill, more of an orator, but in many people's eyes, regardless of what you think of him politically, he is the standard, if you will, to speaking perfection, right? And so this person who is striving for that type of delivery believes that absolute perfection is the key to credibility, certainly, but also authenticity. Yet, interestingly enough, they will also express a desire to be seen as genuine, to be seen as real, to be seen as relatable and authentic. And it's this sort of classic push-pull of wanting to have your cake and eat it too, right? So you're looking for perfection, and yet you also want to have authenticity. So Michael was a client that I worked with, high achieving executive, C-suite, and he was known throughout his company and certainly with his immediate team for this meticulous attention to detail. His presentations, they were always flawless. He did a lot of video content, and it wasn't just his presentation. It was also emails and newsletters and reports, right? Everything that he put his hand to was perfect, or as close to perfect as you could possibly get. However, Mike's obsession with trying to get it all perfect all the time made him insanely critical, not just of himself, but of the other people around him. And what does that do? That ultimately leads to stress. It ultimately led to, not the greatest relationship with the people around him, with his team. His thing was that he was worried about public speaking, speaking on camera, any sort of communication really in general to an audience. He was worried about it, not because he wasn't knowledgeable, not because he was afraid of positioning himself as an expert or afraid of having an audience, but because he was terrified of making a mistake in front of an audience. So there was one presentation actually in particular that was the impetus, and he was having an off day, right? He stumbled over a couple of words, and then he was fixated on those small errors despite the rest of the presentation being a success by anybody's measure. But he had these, and I do talk about this on the regular, these two trains of thought. One was what I'm supposed to be saying, and one was, oh my gosh, I made these mistakes. I sound like an idiot, failure, rejection. It's confirming all the worst things that I've ever thought about myself. And he couldn't bring those two elements back together in real time. He realized in that moment that tendency towards perfectionism was actually holding him back. It wasn't making him more credible, certainly wasn't making him more authentic. He definitely wasn't having an easier time connecting with whoever was watching him, whether it was a client or a team leader or an employee. It was holding him back more than moving him forward. And so the shift for everybody, not just for Mike in this particular moment, the mindset shift is that it is absolutely critical that you recognize that this goal of getting everything perfect leads us away from who we really are, right? And we don't want to ramble, and we don't want to make egregious errors, and we certainly don't want to look like we don't know what we're talking about. But authenticity, connection, that's what it leads to. That's why we talk about authenticity so much. It's not authenticity for authenticity's sake. It's authenticity for having an impact and connecting. It isn't about being flawless. It's about being genuine, warts and all. So the tip of the day when it comes to perfectionism is, and this is, gosh, is so much easier said than done because I struggle with this all the time. Sometimes it keeps me up at night. In fact, I had one of those nights last night, but it's embrace your imperfections. It's okay to aim for excellence. You should aim for excellence. I always say practice every high stakes speech that you're going to do at least 10 times through. And that doesn't mean you're just reading your slides. So you're aiming for excellence, but it is your perspective and your genuine self that is going to be what connects you to your audience. Even if it's a B2B audience in a very sort of stoic and traditional industry. And I'm going to go off on a tiny bit of a tangent here, but I was working with my business coach a couple of weeks back, and we were talking about the different ways that the DISC personality assessment and the way different people, the D, the I, the S's, the C's, the way that they purchase. And we were talking specifically about the D's, the sort of dominating forces. And they generally assume that every decision they make is one that's data-based. It is logistical and rational, and it's based on results and success. And it is, but there's always a deeper level, and it's why do they want those results, or why is that data important? And it ties back to something I mentioned earlier. They want the data and the results that were indicated with whatever service or product it is or coach it is that they're looking on working with or looking to work with, because they want that success for themselves. And why do they want that success for themselves? If you dig a little bit deeper into that, it usually has ties to rejection and failure and status to some degree as well. All of them tie together. But when we fail, it is a confirmation in our minds of not just I'm going to lose my job or I'm going to lose credibility from my team or whatever. It is a confirmation of all the worst things that we've ever thought about ourselves, right? That's what it is. And I still struggle with this every single day, struggling with it right now. But my point is that the authenticity is what will connect you, even with people who fit into a category that we assume is very data and statistical and results driven. So don't confuse precision with your passion, right? And if there were any aha moments in there or you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the comments. I'll answer them at the end. Maybe there was something in there that was particularly helpful, or you think you may have a challenge handling or implementing. So now's your time to go ahead and ask. All right. Next, we're going to talk about embracing your authenticity. So we're going on the opposite end of the spectrum. The two, excellence and authenticity should always be together. But we were talking first about Mike, who is entirely focused on perfection. And now we're talking about not just embracing authenticity, but the opposite side of the spectrum, the flip side of the coin. This group who falls in this bucket, if you will, are the people who are adamant about their, this is me, I am who I am stance, right? And these people generally resist any form of correction. I'm going to put correction in air quotes because really, I think the word that I'm looking for is guidance or redirection. And this group generally wears their speech habits, and not just their speech habits, but everything about themselves, almost like a badge of honor, regardless of how it affects their message's reception. So they look not at necessarily Winston Churchill's, but they look to people who speak in, there's not actually a specific person that I would use to showcase this, but people who speak with natural dialects, which is okay to do, very casual mannerisms, things that maybe aren't entirely professional. And they look at those as a sign of authenticity. However, they too, much like our first group, desire to have this area taken seriously as well. And when I say this area, they desire to be taken seriously. They desire to possess gravitas without having any criticism that comes along with it. So Libby, and again, all names have been changed, was this really talented, ambitious project manager, didn't own her own business, didn't do project management for others, but in a corporation. And she'd always prided herself on being absolutely unapologetically her full self wherever she was. And she wore this very casual communication style, like I said, almost as a badge of honor. So she thought, I'm very straightforward. I'm a straight shooter. I use a lot of colloquialisms. It makes me super relatable. She also noticed, though, that her messages miss the mark in formal settings. And she had this goal for herself of having a leadership role, of having a real impact within her organization and also outside of it, speaking on stages and doing media and podcasts, et cetera, et cetera. And when she thought about her goals as it related to leadership, it seemed increasingly out of reach, and her messages weren't having the desired effect. Yes, they were entertaining and people liked to listen to them, but they generally didn't do whatever the thing was that she wanted them to do afterward, right? Barring a direct order to a subordinate. So she was stuck in this, as I mentioned, this is me, take it or leave it mindset. And the truth is, a lot of times when we are in that, I've been there. In fact, I would say I tend to fall more in that arena because of my background, specifically my news background, my entertainment sort of background, if you will. And what we find is that this whole "this is me" mindset works absolutely for entertainment, but can potentially limit potential. Potentially limit potential. Allow myself to introduce myself. Right. So she was limiting herself ultimately, is what it came down to. And the "take me as I am" thing was certainly fun and it made her memorable, but there was a happy medium that both Mike and Libby were missing that comes with bringing those two elements together. So the pivotal moment for Libby was when she got feedback after a presentation, and her content absolutely solid, but her delivery was very casual. And I would always say your delivery should not be like a white paper. It should be conversational, but she used slang so often that it really detracted from the professionalism of the report and the gravity of her message, the seriousness of her message. And it was a wake-up call. And I will say that oftentimes people, and again, myself, that fall into this sort of "take me as I am" mentality really means that we're often so sensitive to criticism that it feels like a punch in the gut every time we get it. So we use this "take me as I am" as almost a defense mechanism. I'm not going to work to get better because I'm afraid inside that I won't fail, or that I will fail rather. If I have a coach, I also am going to have to come face to face with my weaknesses and my flaws. And that is unpleasant, to say the least, for most of us. I still hate it. I hate looking at my video content and listening to my podcasts. And that's why, because I have to come face to face with my flaws. 25 years in, I still loathe it. I've just learned that it's something I have to do. And the purpose is greater than that. But oftentimes we fall into the "this is me" mentality because it's a defense. We're not going to really try any harder because, oh my gosh, if we try harder and we fail, then we really suck. And it really is a confirmation. Now, if we fail, we can say, I didn't really try that hard. It was never my goal. So it saves our ego a little bit. So the mindset shift here is that being truly authentic does involve embracing your natural self, but it also means that you're open to growth. It's about finding your voice, what it is that you want to talk about, who you are, and the way that you talk about it in a way that respects your individuality, who you are, and also your audience's needs, right? How do you bring that into the picture? Because at the end of the day, really, your audience's needs are first and foremost. So the takeaway tip here is that balance between these two elements is the secret sauce. It is the secret to success. If you work on refining your skills, not necessarily to erase your personality, but to enhance your ability to convey your message effectively, to enhance the ability of the audience to absorb it, to make it easy for them to understand. Your goal is to be authentically you in a way that resonates with and respects the audience. So we're bringing the audience into this now. So how do you bring those two elements together? And if you have questions or any aha moments or, that's cool, I never thought of it that way, drop them in the comments. All right, so next, how you find that middle ground, how you bring the perfectionist in you and the whatever, take me as I am, how you bring those two things together. So this is really the crux of what we're talking about today. And it is all about finding the ground between the unattainable ideal of perfection and that sort of unyielding insistence on raw, unfiltered authenticity. Neither one of those extremes are the path to being an effective communicator or having a genuine connection. So this particular story is about Alex. And Alex was a mid-level manager who, in the process of working together, discovered this really transformative way of finding his voice. So for him, Alex was a VP. He was the VP of an organization. I apologize. I was getting him confused with somebody else. And Alex had always struggled with speaking. So he was caught in that trap of trying to create this perfect sort of facade on the outside. Every word was meticulously scripted, and scripting's not a bad idea, but there's a sweet spot. And the goal of his scripting was so that he would avoid any possible chance of making a mistake. Now, despite the fact that he took all of these steps to script and be perfect, he still felt that what it was that he was saying, and this applies to, he said, anywhere that he would show up, whether it was on video for social media, whether it was on a stage for public speaking, either at a conference, an industry conference, or at an internal event, whether he was on camera for a video podcast or a client pitch, right? So in all of those instances, he felt that what it was that he was saying wasn't resonating. He also felt like he didn't have that warmth. Those two things go together, and the audience was disengaged. Those three things go together. Lack of a solid message, disengaged audience, lack of warmth. Alex was looking for perfection. He was stressed out. He was totally unfulfilled, and it wasn't having his speaking engagements and public speaking appearances were not having the desired effect. They weren't bringing in clients. They weren't establishing him as a thought leader. They weren't enhancing his leadership skills, his team, et cetera, et cetera. So the turning point for Alex came when we worked together in a workshop environment on authentic communication, right? It sounds very generic, but he learned that connecting with his audience wasn't about, right? We talked about before, wasn't about eliminating every flaw, but it was about being genuine, vulnerable, and relatable, right? So we had to learn how to tell stories, and he had to learn that he was not just a deliverer of facts, that he was also performing as well. And any speaking engagement, that's too generic of a word. Anytime you are in front of an audience talking, whether it's on a lens or on a stage, it is a performance. And we're going to talk about performance mindset in, I believe it's 3 episodes from now, right? The difference between that. But to go back to Alex, he was really excited about that revelation, if you will, that epiphany that he had. And so he began to bring in these personal stories. He began to be able to show genuine enthusiasm anytime that he was speaking and to an audience. He stopped obsessing over the occasional stumble, and instead he was focusing on clarity and passion. And so the mindset shift for him, and then his speaking engagements and any public appearance did start having the effect that he wanted it to. His team thought he was more credible and relatable, so there was more buy-in. He had media opportunities that actually generated clients and revenue. His social media video began to bring in inbound leads and requests for discovery and sales calls, right? So if you understand that the most important and impactful message and communication comes from a place of balanced authenticity, being true to yourself while also considering the expectations and the norms of your audience and the industry in which your audience resides, or the industry in which your ideal target or client resides. So The takeaway from today's episode is you're looking to bring all of these elements together. And I can help you do that if you have questions. I'll put a link in the show notes and I'll talk about how to get in touch with me at the end. But the key is to really reflect on your personal goals, your professional goals, and they're often overlapped. Oftentimes it's confidence building as well, to allow you to take these next steps and push the envelope, bring in those personal and professional goals together, and then tailor your communication style accordingly. Bring in your unique self and your desire for credibility and tailor your communication style accordingly. It's not about conforming to a specific standard. It's definitely not rebelling against another sort of standard. It's about finding a voice that is uniquely yours and is also effective and resonates with the people that you're hoping to talk to. If you remember one thing, remember this: you cannot be your natural self and have no one ever criticize you. And you cannot play it safe and conservative and have people feel like you went out on a limb to connect with them. Every single thing you want is on the other side of figuring those two elements out. And I hope that what we've talked about today makes sense and that it's brought some element of understanding or an aha moment as you were listening. And Rick, I see your message here. And in sports, the color guy typically comes across as very personable, while the play-by-play is the more professional. That's such a great analogy. I'm not a sports person, which is why I never would have thought of it, but that's absolutely true, except that in this case, as the speaker, you are actually looking to do both of those things. You are the play-by-play guy or gal, and you are the color commentator at the same time. Thank you, Rick. That was super smart and very helpful. And I'm going to steal it. All right. Next week, Thursday, 10 a.m. Eastern. They are names that you're talking about: Harrison Ford, we're talking about Nicole Kidman, Jennifer Lawrence, Shania Twain, Brad Pitt, people who are famous, who are rich, who are talented, who are beautiful, people who have achieved amazing levels of success as communicators, who on the silver screen absolutely shine, success playing other characters, but all have stage fright. They hate showing up on the talk show circuit because there's not a character that they can push themselves into there. They have to show up as themselves. They don't have the armor of their character or their alter ego. And a lot of them design an alter ego. We'll talk about how to do that in an upcoming episode as well. But why does that happen? Why is someone so great communicating through a character on a screen, and why are they so afraid showing up as themselves? Why does it happen? How do you get through it? That's what we're going to be talking about on next week's episode of The Carrie Barrett Show Live. If you're interested in scheduling a free Confident Speaker strategy call, you can do so using my booking link, calendly.com, Carrie Barrett, Confident on Camera strategy call. We're going to have a link in the comments and a link in the show notes as well. That's all for today. Thank you for joining me, and I hope that you have an absolutely spectacular, a wonderful week, and I will see you back here, same time, same place.